some financial management reporting and metrics. So today's session, I'm just going to talk in terms of types of metrics that you could track, explain a little bit about some of the variables that are contributing to that you can get out of your PSA solution. And then next week, we have basically an OpenAir specific version of this, so we'll talk about the different types of metrics you can get out of the NetSuite OpenAir solution. So this is more theory, I guess, but I do show you some charts that are pretty easy to replicate in whatever financial system or PSA system that you have for your financial metrics. All the PSAs on the market should be able to achieve what we're going to talk about today. But as I usually do before we get into the meat of things, just to kind of give you guys an update on what things are going on in the world of Top Step that you might be interested in. So our OpenAir version of this webinar is going to be next Thursday at the same time, 1 p.m. And this month we are actually going to look to having an OpenAir user group in the Atlanta area. We don't have a location yet for that, so stand by. If anyone is interested in being a host, certainly email me, let me know. We were targeting March 23rd, but it's always a little difficult to get these started at the first part of the year with everyone wrapping up year-end and Easter break coming up and all kinds of stuff. So stay tuned on that. Suite World is actually around the corner, it feels like. It's the last week of April, if you're not aware of it, in Las Vegas. We are a silver sponsor, so if you're going to be going to Suite World or would like to ask us, should you go to Suite World, certainly let us know. If you're going to be there, we'd love to see you. We're going to have a booth, so we'd love to see you at the expo. And for those of you who are part of TSIA or attend those conferences, the TSW, Technology Services World Spring Conference is again in San Diego, May 7th through 9th. We are also a sponsor there, so maybe we'll catch you at one of those places. But what you really care about is the topic of today. And the topic of today is really the financial management metrics. And the way that I think about financial management metrics is you can leverage the metrics to predict where you are going based on where you've been, and then use that information to drive where you want to be. Because I think I love doing data mining and analytics and just looking at data and having it talk to me about what decisions I should make to shift the organization to go a different direction or to pay more attention to something that is not performing as I would expect it to. So there's a lot of there's obviously running the organization and collecting information is a big part of what a PSA tool is, but equally as important is how to get that data back out and what to do with that data, how to consume it, and how to have it talk to you about where you're going as an organization. And it is true, you can really predict where you're going based on where you've been unless you take corrective action or you take some strategic maneuvers to change the fate of the path, so to speak. Now, professional services themselves, when you think about data collecting, data mining, and the data itself, it's really based on three things. The first and the most important is the key asset you have, which are the people in the organization. And they are responsible for delivering your projects or your service offerings, and those service offerings bring money in the door. So people, projects, and money are all sort of the three aspects that go into any kind of professional services measure or metric. Now, those measures themselves can lend themselves to the predict where you're going based on where you've been to drive where you want to be by categorizing those different measures in four areas. A measured, measured metric, which is something based on actuals. So what did we do in Q1 of this year? How did we do for utilization? What kind of revenue did we make? What kind of margins did we hit? Then the second one is more of a trending measure. So trending measures are more, they're a combination of where you've been, but it gives you a little bit more information about where you may be going. So trending is if you see, if you're trending utilization, for example, quarter after quarter, and you see numbers slowly start to rise, it does tend to indicate that you are getting more productivity out of people, and your pipeline and your backlog are being fulfilled quicker versus something that's very unsteady. To kind of complement that, though, the third type of measure is a predictive measure. So the trending sort of gives you insight into what may be happening, but then you also want to do, like, this is where your forecasting starts falling into place. You're forecasting what kind of resources that you need, the demand based on different types of roles. You're forecasting the demand of the different types of service offerings, the technology that you need to deliver. You're forecasting the revenue that's coming in the door that'll turn around and fund the ability to bring more people on. So the measured is actual, trending sort of straddles the two and shows you sort of where the measured is going. And predictive is really where you're taking more advantage of planning out the data and seeing where it's taking you. And then proactive is the drive piece of it. So measured is the where you've been, trending is the mix between where you've been and where you're going. Predictive is where you're going, and proactive is how you drive yourself to where you want to be. So proactive means more of see where you're going and take that information and feed it back into a continual improvement loop, and that from there be able to identify things that need to change in the organization, in yourself, in your offerings, to be able to write yourself on the path to hit your goals. And all of these 4 measured categories have what they're called key performance indicators, or KPIs, that reflect measures. And many of those are financially oriented. So let's take a quick glance at a few by categorizing them into the where you've been, where you're going, and how do you get to where you need to be. So one of the ones of the where you've been category, which is financial based, is realization. So realization and utilization get a lot of discussion in professional services, but realization is really, are we getting the bill rate that we expect in the organization? So you're looking at what you're charging out for all of your work. You're looking at the billable hours that you're working, and of course the billable hours are typically your utilization measure. But the value of those hours is really a telling metric to say, you could be hitting 100% utilization, but if you're only hitting 50% realization, you're not making the money that you're expecting. People are just as busy as you expect, but you're not reaching capacity of the revenue that you could be bringing in because your realization rate is too low. You're giving a lot of discounts, for example. And I would see this being a challenge in organizations like software companies where the professional services teams are really part of the software enablement in many cases, and so discount rates tend to happen often in that scenario. So realization is a really good financial metric that sort of combines not only the realization, but it also, if you sit it side by side with utilization, you get a bigger picture of what's going on in the organization. And by looking at your realization, quarter after quarter and doing trending with it, you'll be able to see, where are things happening? Are you having to give more and more discounts to be able to reach revenue targets, but now you're working your people like dogs and you're not getting the margin that you want? Okay. So that's a pretty easy one to get where you've been, because if you have a PSA, you've got time, you've got financial components about the value of that time, so you should be able to get a realization rate and some graphs and some reports on that. The next one is average bill rate. So this is where you're trending average, but this is a little different than realization, because I think the average bill rates, you should look at it from a couple of different angles. There's your bill rate of every hour that's billable. What's the bill rate that you're getting for that? What's the charge out rate that you're getting? And of course, everyone has pretty much a price list or a standard rate that they use based on the different types of resources in the organization. And then through the negotiation factor, you end up at a rate that you're charging the customer. And so you're wanting to kind of keep an eye on that average bill rate that's going out the door. And that's the chart on the left-hand side, sort of what is the average rate based on the hours that are being charged out to the customer. But in reality, that's not the full picture. So the full picture is factoring in, okay, let me factor in all of those admin time hours and non-billable hours and free work hours and travel time, things that people are doing to say that they're working for the company, but they're not necessarily translating directly into money. And in some companies, there's even a further breakdown. So there's the billable hours, then there's usually something called like bonus or credited or productive hours, which are things that lead to the company making money, like pre-sale support or investing in capital costs, like or doing R&D to build new products. And then there's the final one, which is, well, just, this is, I'm going into meetings, I'm attending this webinar. Those are all admin time things. And when you factor all that time in, what kind of impact does that have on your bill rate, and where are your bill rates from an organization for those billable headcount? Okay. So I'd like to factor that into the average bill rate so you can see, that this is a combination, again, utilization along with the billing, so that you can see where your bill rates are trending and if you're hitting the average bill rate that you're really wanting to get, like the minimum bill rate that you should be getting. And the last where you've been one is more of the revenue trending. So where are we as a company year over year? And this is a pretty common one. A lot of companies report this even financially, publicly, like, where were they year over year from Q4 and Q3 and Q2. So if you trend the revenue in the organization, you can see a pattern of whether the organization is on a slow growth, if it has spikes, if it's got some unique things. Like in this graph here, you can see there's a spike in one year and then it settles back down. So something interesting must have happened that year. Why was there a big spike? Maybe it was a big, unique project where you brought a lot of staff log in. Maybe there was some other contributing factor. But this gives you a lot of information about where the company itself is going. And this, of course, is always going to be available from your finance, from your ERP. But if you have a PSA, ideally you can also get this from the PSA for view, and then be able to break this down by maybe P&L group. Now, on the where you're going, so this is more the trending. This is more getting into the predictive area. So where am I going as an organization? So margin is a decent one to start looking at, because margin is something that you can look at the actuals of margin when a project's closed, all the time and expense they're in, basically the cost of your labor, where did we end up, and being able to compare that to your as-sold margin, for example. I love doing that kind of metric, because you had a plan, and then when you executed that plan, how did you end up at the end of the day? And some people argue that if you are running a T&M shop where every hour is billable, that metric is not necessarily needed in the organization. But I sort of turn that around a bit and say, well, even T&M shops have free work, customer sat, things that you're doing as non-billable that should be factored in, because that will actually impact your as-sold versus your as-delivered margin. But the PSA tool, if you remember, is also the thing that you do for resource scheduling. And the scheduling should give you a blueprint of where you're going in the organization and the forecast of the revenue that you should be getting, and the forecast of the billing. And if you're forecasting billing and you're forecasting labor, you should be able to forecast cost and forecast margin. So look at your margin trending in the past year, and then look at the forecast of margin this year and see if you're on track to hit the as-sold margin. So you should be able to do this. Even project managers, you can give them the ability to sort of see the forecast margin and help them have tools to be able to manage projects and correct the use of expensive resources to be able to get the margin back to where you need it to be. Okay. And then taking that a step further, because we are working in databases after all in many of the PSA tools, why not break down this margin not only at a company level, but break it down by the different types of things that you do as an organization? What about training? What about product enablement? What about maintenance and support? What kind of margin are you getting on those from a labor perspective? And which ones are sort of the high margin areas, and which ones are the ones that you just sort of skate by? And are those in line with where you expected as an organization? Things like customer support tend to be, well, as long as I can recover my cost, I'm good. And things that are more consulting oriented, those are the more profitable ones. So those are different sort of checks and balances that you can also use in the organization to make sure that the type of offering is earning the margin that you expected. And forecast, of course, you can't know where you're going unless you have some kind of forecast. I like to look at forecasts in both a backlog burn, so you've got commitment from customers to be able to deliver services, and so you have this much money that you have to burn or hours that you have to burn to make that money for the organization. And then there's that pipeline factor, so how do you factor in the stuff that the sales team is finding? The sales team is working with customers to find the right solution or to agree upon the right terms, and that will come in eventually. So bringing in that pipeline and combining that with your backlogs gives you your forecast, but you should be able to look at it in both a pipeline and backlog kind of split, so you know how much is sort of baked in or guaranteed versus how much is, well, I hope we can get it, and nobody likes to build a strategy on hope. I know that, but that's what pipeline is. Pipeline is really we're hoping that work comes in. We're expecting that work to come in, so that having some kind of financial metric that shows you that split and that forecast of money will help you make decisions about hiring and the types of skill sets that you need in the organization. And going along the lines of the headcount, even though we're talking about financial metrics for professional services does have that resource factor in there. So we need to understand if people are hitting their utilization targets and their expected number of billable hours, and we're hitting our expected billable rate and our realizing the rate that we want, like what kind of revenue could we be making as an organization, and then comparing that to things like maybe the demand that we have or the revenue targets that we have in the company, and sort of keeping an eye on that. Are we right-sized as a company? Do we have too many people that we need to look at maybe doing some layoffs? Do we have too few people, which is typically the situation? And then we need to hire people, and how do we factor in the fact that they take 3 months to ramp up, and we need to spend time investing billable resource time to educate them. So a capacity versus target or capacity versus demand type report is a financial metric that helps you understand if you'll even be able to achieve the targets that you've set for yourself from a revenue target. And combining all this together, sort of where you've been and where you're going, ultimately you would want to be able to log in every day and see a beautiful graph like this that says, and where I want to be. So here's my revenue plan, that orange line that you see here, and how am I doing against that revenue plan? Am I hitting the revenue plan that I put in place for myself? And where are things not quite coming out right that I can take action on and go back over the trending items, the actual items, and make some strategic decisions so that you can drive yourself to the path you want to be on. Now, some of the most common KPIs besides the ones that I showed you in the graphs, because I like to look at stuff in graphs. I think it's very telling to see things in graphs. You see trends and patterns easier, I think. It's just visually, that's the way I think. But there are a lot of metrics out there, and some people are more, they want to see the numbers. So the variety of KPIs are out there are quite diverse, but they all come back to the 3 main categories of professional services, which are people, their service offerings, and the earnings. So really, to get the most out of that data mining, you want to take all those different measures and align them up to the areas that will help you make decisions about hiring or maybe new product offerings or the bill rates that you're looking to drive or the way that you're pricing out certain types of offerings. And once you start identifying those areas and those items, you can put it all together into a series of what kind of metric is this? Is this an actual metric where I'm doing measured actuals? Am I doing a trending metric so that I can actually see what is happening over time, which leads into being predictive on where I'm going from a forecast perspective, and then being very proactive and taking all that information and feeding it back in. It's hard to get to just jump into this level, I think, because what you want to do is you want to look at the data you're capturing in your PSA. You want to look at where you've been and what information you can get about where you're going. because based on how you're tracking the information, you may have to right size or right adjust your PSA tool to even get you to the point to be able to do these types of metrics. And these metrics are very, very helpful, very valuable. Many of the PSA tools on the market have a number of these out of the box that you can leverage, and then you just modify it according to the specifics of your organization. So you'll see as you look through each of these boxes, the whole people, offerings, and earnings area, and the measured, trending, predictive, and proactive aspects of it, you'll see that the same type of measure shows up in multiple places. And that's because it really is a time dimension in how you use the data. The measured is always historical, so you should be able to get all of this from an actual perspective. And the trending is something that you should be able to get from an actual perspective as long as you've been using a PSA or have data in the PSA that's more than 1 month old. Like if you are just going live with your PSA and you have no historical data, getting to a trending measure is going to be a little bit more difficult in your PSA tool. But if you've been using the same system for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or more, trending should be something you should very, very easily be able to get out of the tool. And then the predictive is really understanding how you're using your PSA to forecast need, to forecast resources, to plan out what's going to be delivered when. And that becomes an area where if you're not doing that in your PSA, you're probably not taking advantage fully of the PSA tool, Professional Services Automation tool that you have, because you're using it more of as an actuals tracker. So I would encourage you to reach out to us, to your other consulting firms that you may have worked with on your tool, to understand how you can be more predictive and get more predictive measures out of the tool. And then the proactive piece is actually not as much of data coming out of the tool, it's what you're doing with the data. So the proactive is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plan out that I need to hire somebody in June. So how do you factor that new hire into your PSA, and how can you see that what if scenario ripple through all of your reports? If I hire somebody in June and they're fully productive by September, how does that impact my capacity of revenue to be delivered? If I hit the realization, what kind of realization impact does it have, and the utilization and so forth in the organization. So this is all fine and good. It's great for me to put slides up and show you graphs, but how do you actually start? How do you take what you have as a system? How do you start coming up with these types of measures, and how do you make sure that you have the data the way that you need it to be? So I would say the first way to start is not just jumping in and saying, okay, I'm going to pull average utilization across the organization, or I'm going to pull average earnings for the company. I would jump into things like, well, what are you delivering in services, and what kind of resources are you using to do the delivery? So it's the what and the who that you're looking at, because those are two main facets that you need to be able to segregate the data by. Okay, if you lump everyone into one big pool, yes, it will tell you some basic information about the services group, but it won't necessarily give you information about what type of resource do you need, what type of offering is struggling because you need to do more marketing on it or something. When you do break out the types of services, then look within those services. So you may have software enablement teams, and then the different products that you do software enablement for. You may have solution architecture teams and the different types of industries that they work on. So review the types of offerings that you're doing, and then set up a way that you can look at what did you quote and what did you deliver, so that you can compare that as sold, as delivered type margin. And what kinds of resources did you expect to need at the beginning, and what did you end up using at the end? So if you're tracking information in those angles, you should be able to pull a lot of data from a data mining perspective of plan versus actual, both from a financial and a project management and a business organization. And finally, review the resources that you have and how you're tracking the information that they're recording in your PSA. Are you tagging time as billable? Are you tagging time in different ways to understand what was actually being done? Not physically like somebody was writing, chapter 3 of the user guide, but you want to understand, was that time that they were spending billable? Were they shadowing? Was it a customer sat situation or an executive oversight situation where all of that time was non-billable? Were they traveling to the customer? So understanding how you're tagging time, I think, is a big part of a PSA tool, because time is a big element to understand where labor is being spent. And then ideally the skill sets, because skill sets are at least sort of job categories or titles, like you're a programmer and you're a project manager and you're a database architect. Even high-level groupings like that can give you a lot of information about demand. And as you're scheduling resources, you see we've got 7 project managers and 1 DB architect, and we keep getting asked for database stuff, so we should probably hire some more database people. And these are all probably things that are very obvious, but it's harder when you're looking at your own system to say, how can I group things together? And if it's not being grouped in the system, you're not going to get the data out. So look at ways to tag projects as different types of offerings, maybe from a financial perspective or revenue earning perspective, tagging people as different kind of job codes or categories, and then being able to build reports that give you that data mining aspect. And once you have all that, you're able to say, okay, now I'm going to set a base set of KPIs, key performance indicators. And this, I expect us to hit as a company, utilization 75%, 98% realization of our bill rate, which is pretty high. So set that as a goal, and then as you set up your reports for your KPIs, you can actually measure against that goal on a regular basis. And that is how you can see where you've been, see where you're going, and then drive yourself to the right path, because if you start seeing a trend going in the wrong direction, then you can take corrective action. And all of this is really, it's possible in Excel. I joke that many of you have heard me joke that the best PSA on the market is Excel. But Excel is still a tool that you're typing into, and if you can invest in a PSA, I would recommend it, because that, like in many tools on the market, has the database behind it, and with that database capability gives you the ability to pull very interesting reports to satisfy your requests. Okay. Commit to a cadence. So this is the harder part. So you can sit down today after this webinar and say, okay, I'm going to go through and I'm going to analyze all of these metrics, and you'll find a lot of great information. And then you'll make some decisions based on what you saw, and then you'll come back in about 6 months and say, you know what, I wonder how we're doing. If you don't do it on a regular basis, you'll lose that trending influence. So you're not going to necessarily see the trending real time that you can take very proactive action. So I would say commit to something like a monthly review internally on some of the bigger metrics, maybe a weekly review on things like timesheet compliance and plan versus actual as far as utilization. And that way you can see the data real time. You'll be able to see how the organization is going, and then take action. Ask the questions of what you're seeing from a measure. Understand where there might be blips in the data, and if that needs to be explained away, that it can be explained away. But typically, trends will show you what action needs to be taken, and then you can drive yourself to the right path.